She then was able to confront this figure. And when she did, it started to kind of dissolve. And then it almost like collapsed at her feet. Then it turned into a fox. It started to kind of dissolve. Into a fox.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural.
There's a pervasive darkness that stretches its fingers across the human experience, lurking at the very edges of what we consider normal. Most of us go through life unaware, glancing past the shadows, ignoring the subtle sense of dread that flickers behind our thoughts, but occasionally, something forces us to confront it. In all this time of investigating the unknown, I've learned that the real monsters aren't always in the shadow of the night or on the eerie glow of the supernatural. They often live within us. This darkness or shadow, as Jungian psychology might describe it, is a piece of our very psyche, our very own psyche. But what happens when the shadow takes the wheel, when the veil between the internal turmoil and the external malevolence grows thin? Shadow work, as defined by psychologists, is the arduous process of confronting the hidden parts of ourselves, the suppressed desires, the fears, the primal urges we bury deep in our subconscious. For most, this work is about understanding and integrating these aspects. But for some, this shadow isn't simply an abstract concept. It becomes a living entity that consumes the self. People we label as psychopaths or sociopaths, those who seem devoid of empathy, who navigate life without the moral compass that guides the rest of us, may be actualizations of the shadow, fully realized. They walk among us, looking as ordinary people, yet they operate with a kind of cold, somewhat calculating detachment that is both terrifying and fascinating. Psychopathy and sociopathy are often viewed through the lens of mental health or social dysfunction. But what if we're missing something much more profound? What if the actions and behaviors, those chilling acts of cruelty, the manipulation, the violence, are not merely the product of a damaged mind, but the glimpse of a far darker, far more sinister force at work? Could it be that in these individuals, the shadow isn't just a psychological concept, but a physical presence, a force that thrives on chaos, pain, and suffering? If the mind is the final frontier, and these people may have unwittingly crossed into a dimension we dare not explore. Think about it, the cold stare of a psychopath, the chilling charm of a sociopath. These individuals seem almost otherworldly. Detached from the human condition, could they be more connected to something other than we realize? Could their behavior be a symptom of something beyond? Something beyond the mere misfiring of neurons? What if the shadow they live in touches on the sinister forces we've long suspected but never understood? The ancient world often spoke of possession, of evil entities that influence our thoughts, feeding our fears, and driving us into madness. What if these ancient stories were not mere superstition, but fragmented memories of a darker truth? Perhaps these so-called monsters of the mind aren't anomalies, but echoes of something far older, something that lingers at the fringes of human understanding. A sort of cosmic darkness that reaches into our world, twisting the minds of the vulnerable, pushing them to act in ways that defy our moral framework. As we delve deeper into the shadow work of the human psyche, we may be unknowingly peering into the dimension that defies our rational understanding, one where morality or empathy, even humanity, are alien concepts. The minds of psychopaths and sociopaths may serve as a gateway showing us that there's more to the human experience than we care to admit. These individuals force us to ask ourselves, are we simply battling the shadows within? Or are we engaging in a far larger war with something that lies beyond? The truth remains just out of reach, and it waits in the shadows.
Greetings, listeners. In this conversation, we embark on a journey into the darkest corners of the human mind. Imagine waking from a nightmare drenched in sweat, heart pounding, as if you've been pursued by something unknown, unfeeling, incapable of remorse or emotion. These are not just figments of imagination, but echoes of our deepest fears. Among us walk those devoid of empathy, psychopaths, sociopaths, whose actions chill our souls. In this episode, we'll also venture into the realm of some Jungian archetypes, perhaps meeting the shaman who dances between worlds, unlocking secrets of the subconscious. Prepare yourself as we unravel the mysterious threads binding nightmares, demons, and the enigmatic figures shaping our reality. Joining us on our quest is one who, having dove deep into the depths of psychology and returned soulfully aware of the unconscious mind, she is the killer whisperer, the mind hunter, spook sleuth, and fellow coffee snob. Melissa Kim Corter, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, BT. I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. And as we start the show, let's explore who you are and why it is you are one of the leading curators of an expensive art supply catalog.
Oh, I love it. Oh my gosh. Well, I guess maybe to start, I can share that I feel like anyone that kind of gets into this line of work is usually trying to understand themselves on some level, just as much as they're looking at, the darkest parts of someone else's mind. There's usually something stirring within that kind of leads down that path. And that's sort of how it started for me. And the brief version that I think is helpful to kind of begin with is when I was a child, I played this really weird game where I'd kind of like wander through the woods around my house, and I'd play detective and flip over rocks and dig in the dirt, and I was completely convinced I was going to find a body. And I'm talking like maybe 6 or 7 years old. I wasn't like a teenager yet or anything. And I would just have this relentless game, and I just felt like I was going to solve a crime. And I don't even know how many years I did that for. And, play Bloody Mary, getting everybody in the bathroom, turning off the lights and, trying to terrify the neighborhood kids and stuff like that. But I always had this weird kind of darker side, games, interest, movies. And one day my mother actually sat me down. I want to say it was somewhere between 14, 16 years of age, and told me that there actually had been a serial killer who had dumped bodies in the region where I lived around my home, not in my backyard or anything like that, but close enough that it certainly had our attention. And I always found that like such a bizarre thing. I couldn't reconcile that within my own mind because I was obsessed with studying what we would call like psychopaths and serial killers from a really young age. And when she sat me down to have this conversation, my mind flashed back immediately to that game of digging in the woods. Like, where does that come from? Is that something that I made up? Is that something I tuned into? And I don't have the answer to this day, but I do think there's curiosities and things like that are interesting, that kind of show us where some of our work is sort of already happening in the world, and if we listen to whatever you want to call that, an impulse and intuition, there's these really interesting parallels that start to reveal themselves. And I just decided to track them and trace them and follow them.
There was a national forest killer back in the early 2000s, and that's where he was hiding the bodies. But that was not that long ago. It's kind of scary that you brought up the idea of somebody burying bodies in the woods and you're hoping to find somebody.
Yeah. Creepy, right? And certainly make it difficult for conversation in the household.
Wow. So let's give the audience some basic understanding of what is a psychopath versus what is a sociopath in the clinical sense.
Sure. So there's a lot of debate around this. There's no definitive rule when it comes to what is what. There's too many people that have varying opinions. Some of them overlap. And the DSM-5 doesn't necessarily clarify what a psychopath is. And that's the diagnostic statistical manual, which we would look up different types of clinical diagnoses. We'd have patterns or symptoms of behavior, things like that can kind of say, here's the box that this person's behavior kind of fits in. And when it comes to that, there's a lot of confusion, uncertainty. It starts to pull on other disciplines. We start getting into religion. We start getting into spirituality. There's questions of empathy. Is there a soul? Is there not a soul? So for that reason, it's such a huge emotionally charged area that's difficult to kind of put into its own box. So one of the rules that I kind of have sort of adapted, or I should say adopted, I find that I resonate with the idea that psychopaths are born and sociopaths are made. That's the simplistic version of it. There's shared characteristics. That doesn't mean that one has more or less trauma than the other, but that just sort of helped me in the research to kind of separate these two, to give a little bit more awareness or understanding of the being made part. Then we can get deeper into conversation around trauma, the types of trauma, things like that. But it also makes it a little more chilling than when we think of the psychopath being born that way, coming into this world this way. And when I say this way, there are various characteristics and different traits and qualities that these two types of figures, individuals, would demonstrate. And one of the biggest ones, which you mentioned in the opening, is that challenge of empathy, the idea of empathy, lack of empathy, consciousness, a conscience in itself. And those are things that are really difficult to prove, to give some type of evidence to and say, well, yes, this person lacks a soul because look at what they did. But yet if we take any kind of pattern of behavior and break it down, and if we take away the emotional component of how we feel about it, Usually we're left with facts, we're left with a process, we're left with ritual, we're left with a series of events. So I kind of see these things also as, this is where it ties into the Jungian work, projections of what it is that we're placing on these figures when we're investigating, and our own beliefs that are kind of muddled within all of that.
Right, so basically our own preconceived notions can help or hinder coloring our particular understanding of what. I mean, it was Freud who explained that basically all acts of psychopathy was basically this drive conflict that for some silly reason he believed that it was out of some kind of repressed sexual or repressed aggression from the background. So like you said, the psychopath is born, the sociopath is made. And if we consider that as the likelihood, for example, then what we are saying is that one has some kind of repressed emotions that are stunted or not being fully examined, and then the other one has had to suppress those particular emotional needs.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I feel like there's so many layers to this, for sure. There's so many layers, and the more that you kind of dive into it, the more confusing and overwhelming it can become. But I do think that suppression and repression and oppression, all three of them play different roles. And I'll just kind of, without going into like enormous detail on it, oppression comes from the outside. It's usually an external force that's causing us to silence ourselves, to shut down. So that's oppression. Repression is something that instinctively happens. We don't necessarily have control over it. It's a protective mechanism of the psyche that just pushes information down out of the view of the ego. And then the suppression is conscious. It's when we're consciously pushing things down. We don't want to feel it. We don't want to see it. We don't want to hear it. And so those different things, I think there are overlapping experiences of all of them on some level. But just as you were talking, something that kind of popped into my mind around this is the idea of ego. And its role is so important when you're talking about Freud and these drives. And I come from more of a Jungian background, and I agree with a lot of things of Freud and Jung. I think there's a lot of valid points where they come together when they were getting along and they were agreeing.
Sure.
And then there's some things too, I think, where they, kind of go off on a different path. But the idea of these drives, something that I've noticed just in my own research is, if we take the psychopath as an example, and whether this is a sociopath, a psychopath, let's use the archetype or the figure of like the serial killer, just because it usually holds our interest. It's a huge figure that evokes a lot of emotion for us. And if we were to consider one of the differences between us and them, so to speak, is that we could say that some of these people look like they are attempting to literalize their fantasies or literalize their compulsions or those drives maybe. And something that I have considered is that suppression, piece of it, where I think there's a couple angles here. One is our fascination with these figures. I think there's a part of us, like, we've probably seen the memes or the jokes online where it's like, I'm just going to relax, have a glass of wine and put on a serial killer documentary. And I will say that's very accurate. That is a very accurate way that I decompress. But one of the reasons for that, I think that we're so drawn to these figures and observing them is because we as humans, when we're, let's just say, operating from right mind, from the right place, from consciousness, right, having our empathy intact, we know what's right, we know what's wrong, we also know what's accepted by society, we kind of have an idea what our roles are in the world and with each other to an extent, and the ego's function has so much to do with that. It has so much to do with keeping us in check. We might have an inner thought about something and we may not express it because we have an understanding for the most part that it's not going to be well accepted, or that we just don't talk about those things in public, or don't admit we have this darker side. Yet these individuals, if there is trauma, let's say, or if this is something that they're born with, I could see where if the ego is impacted, we might have something called a fragile ego. And usually what this means is it doesn't have the ability to help us with healthy boundaries. It doesn't give us this sense of us, like I as a person. It won't necessarily will collapse or crumble sometimes. Like, let's say somebody looks at us kind of funny or has something not so nice to say, we might completely just collapse. Whereas somebody that has a little bit of healthy self-esteem or confidence, they can put up with that. They can handle some criticism. They can maybe even, talk back, fight back, or present different information. They're not necessarily always going to fall apart when somebody has an opposing view. But if there's a fragile ego, it's quite vulnerable, actually. So I would wonder about these individuals and the quality of health with the ego, which isn't something we can measure physically, which is one of the things I think we're constantly looking for when we talk about these individuals. We want some physical thing in the brain to say, hey, this is the answer. But that idea of suppression and repression, it's a huge factor, I believe personally, in why things are literalized between one person and not another. And in the more trauma we have, of course, it does impact the brain, our decision-making process. It's certainly not an excuse, but a factor. So yeah, when you were talking about drive, that kind of spurred some different ideas and thoughts along these lines.
There's actually a joke. I'm going to make a joke. The reason why documentary serial killer fiction is so popular among women readers specifically is because it's a man who follows through with what he means to do. And it's like, this is probably the most horrible joke in the world, but it leads me to say this idea, lack of, well, it's not really a lack, it's more, like you said, a suppression of emotion, either suppressed willingly or unwilling or unknowingly by repression. But it leads to major people within our society who we depend upon to be able to suppress specific states of consciousness. And that's like the surgeon, the firefighter, soldiers. And then what is historically interesting that I've been looking at is the shaman having to repress or suppress things that he's having to deal with. And I thought that we could look at this basically as moving from, say, some barbarian view of, I'll use the word evil, but I mean human malevolence when I say evil. And so basically we're moving from this barbaric thought that what's causing these issues is an external form or an external loci of influence to where it's more internal. And I do believe it would have been Freud who would have considered this sadism or masochism.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking from I would say a Jungian oriented sort of perspective, which is a little more my expertise, I definitely could see this because one of the theories is that the deeper a deep part of the psyche, which is sort of the framework, the model of our mind and the different parts of mind. Psyche is a Greek word for soul, but it really does contain all of these different layers of mind. And we talked about the ego, which is one of those layers. It's actually a complex, but we also, within that psyche, we have the outer layers, the persona. So that's the part of us that meets the world. It's kind of like our skin emotionally, right? It's a barrier between outer and inner. And then when you get past the persona, you get to the ego. When you get past the ego, you get to the true self. And if you keep going and you go past the true self, you get into this territory of shadow. And the way that I explain this for people that are trying to kind of imagine a visual is once we're past the territory of the ego, it's sort of like having a dimmer switch, right? The ability to turn a light on and off. That's what the ego can do for us in a way of suppressing information. So anything that's kind of past, deeper than the ego, can come through an impulse and feeling and sensation. It's often difficult for us to see it, sense it, know it, or if we're not paying attention, if we're distracted, if we're oriented toward the outer world, we're going to be more fixed on appearance or things like that. But the deeper we go within ourselves, the more we go beneath our conscious awareness. That's where the light gets shut off. That's where there's things we can't see. And they're not all bad and scary, even though most people think of them that way. This is where we get into the territory of what Jung called the shadow self. And it really is, it's not a thing in itself that's against us or malevolent or harmful. It's actually more of a containment of things within it, which include not only those impulses and compulsions and things, but also unmanifest talents, skills, gifts, parts of self we haven't met yet. And if we go a little bit past, there's a collective shadow and there's a personal shadow. There's a personal unconscious and a collective unconscious. And the idea with these things is that these layers connect us in such a deep way. And it's one of the reasons we are able to kind of have similar understanding of things that we didn't necessarily have to have a super linear process for. So an example, when you talked about the shaman, we could see that as an archetype. And the archetypes are not these literal beings, but more of these patterns of behavior that we all resonate with or understand. So people even hearing that term shaman are likely having things already pop into their mind about what that might mean for them. And we didn't even describe what it technically is in a sense. So that's an example of an archetype, how it's a pattern of behaviors, characteristics, different things that we would associate with certain behaviors or situations. And this ties into our deep psychology. And it's one of the reasons why we use mythology and myths to tell stories or narratives that are sort of playing out. So it's important just to kind of set the tone a little bit so that people understand also that archetypes are not stereotypes. So for example, we can all probably relate to the term mother. Now, what we don't know about each other is the kind of mother we had or have until we talk about it, which is a great example of how the archetype can be really the meaning we give to it and the experience we have of it. And there's always a shadow side, and then there's always a more positive, healthier, balanced side. So this is the same thing, but these deeper archetypal structures are embedded in that collective unconscious layer. So again, that's past the ego, which is one of the reasons that we might suppress information around these things. We might be told or have an idea that we can only think positively about the mother or the father or something else. And so some people will struggle around working things out around a parental figure because they have this idea that it should always be loving and kind. It's the same thing with these figures. When we talk about the shaman, we talk about, if we even think of the psychopath in its own way as an archetype, there's these projections that we're sort of layering onto it. So I just wanted to mention that because I felt like it was in alignment with the sharing on the shaman, this shifting the idea of this barbaric thought and maybe seeing this all a little bit differently.
Yeah, especially when we consider, well, if we look at Carl Jung specifically, here's a man who had experienced otherworldly phenomena from a young age. So if we consider the fact that there is something otherworldly that even an individual like Carl Jung, depth psychologist, who could examine all of these things, as you call, as they're not you call this, as they are called archetypes, and then we realize that we've combined something like mythology to help us categorize those archetypes in an easier to understand. And it's like, as we continue to explore this dark side of humanity, the shadow, there is this aim to address conflict and ignorance and understand human malevolence in that. And at the end, as we look at the ideas that there is something beyond, I feel like there's something beyond the physical realm when we start really looking at some individuals in some individuals in this serial killer idea. There seems to be something deeper, maybe even more supernaturally phenomena going on. And how can we look at that honestly and not say that we're basically saying, if we acknowledge a supernatural reality, how are we not just being primitives again?
I love this. That's such a great topic and idea and area to kind of venture into. And I think the way I would answer it, which of course is not the only way to answer that, would be maybe that's what we need to make peace with in our darker side, is that there is some of that primal instinct. And if we can, maybe what might soften that a little bit for us is to remember that that is often connected to our survival nature, our way of needing to preserve life, and it's a part of who we are within our, deeply embedded in the nervous system within our brains. And even though we've evolved over time, there is this part of us that still very much has this animal-like psyche. We are connected to nature in that way, and some of us, for better or worse, may be more connected to the instinctual, compulsive aspect of things, and in the right or wrong circumstances, we might see that play out. I love that you mentioned, surgeons and military and sort of like these examples of psychopathic individuals and the roles that are kind of accepted. And I think something that just came to me recently, I just want to share, I think this is kind of helpful for those that struggle with the intensity around the subject matter. Some of the psychopathic qualities and traits are not necessarily all terrible. They're different for sure. And I'm not condoning poor behavior or harmful behavior. But if we strip away some of those parts and we just look at their ability to remain extremely, extremely calm in certain situations that would activate someone else, there's different qualities like that are really curious. So I'm going to just kind of reveal a little bit about myself here, but I'm a huge baseball fan. I'm a Mets fan. I usually don't say that much because I get ridiculed for it. But anyhow, as a Mets fan, something that I pay attention to is our pitching. And it's so interesting to me how certain pitchers, regardless of the intensity of what's going on with the crowd, the numbers, as far as like what's at stake for them as they're standing on the mound, there's some of them that have an ability to keep their heart rate low, to get the job done, to shut out the noise, to keep it down, and then flip that in reverse. And we can also see that with some of the batters, right? When they come up to bat, there's some of them that you'll watch them visually trying to discharge energy. They'll take a huge breath. You can tell they're trying to really center, ground themselves, whatever you want to call it. And then there's other ones that don't need to. They just step up, they do what they got to do. They might knock it out of the park. It's it's just these different like fluctuations that we can see in people. So sometimes taking it out of the context a little bit, and again, not to be dismissive of the harm that's caused from those individuals, and we certainly want to keep all of that in mind. But if we can look at people who are demonstrating some of these qualities in a healthier way, which is part of something we would call like sublimation. You learn how to take compulsions or different thoughts and like immerse them into things, art, acting, creativity. It's a whole other world. But if we look at those qualities, you start to see them a little more frequently across various disciplines in the world. But that was something recently I noticed. I was like, man, the pressure. And I thought, but wait a minute. What if they don't have the pressure, right? What if that individual is not responding to pressure? They're likely then more in that category of that potential psychopathic or sociopathic qualities of an individual that is not grappling with the typical situation that would take us out. Like somebody else who's highly intuitive or empathic or deeply feeling and sensitive would be extremely rattled possibly, versus someone that's really deeply within themselves, doesn't care what the external world thinks, is there to do a job and get it done. There's benefit in those qualities. And I think if we can learn to see them and trust our intuition, really, that's the thing. We start to have a different understanding of getting past that persona, getting past the part of us that the person's showing, and getting our deeper sense of how do I feel when I'm around this person, which can tell us more about these other hidden qualities, potential dangers, motivations, which is why it's important that we learn how to get past the mask, they'll call it, the mask, the way that they're presenting in the world. Especially psychopaths and sociopaths will often use superficial charm to blend in. They can be extremely charming, convincing. And so that's disarming. So in a sense, if we're not really deeply connected and trusting our intuition, our instinct, and honestly, even if we are, that doesn't mean we're not going to be fooled. But yet we have this little bit of a protective mechanism that we can start to really build out to sort of just stay alert to things. If somebody leaves you feeling a little unsettled and you can't quite put your finger on it, that's a red flag. Something to pay attention to.
Why are we studying basically the human malevolence or the malevolent force itself at all? I've heard some people say that, well, can't we just concentrate our efforts on stuff that's more constructive, more creative, and look at things that are more compassionate instead of trying to figure out what it is that makes these aberrant human minds tick? And I feel that while this is a strong destructive force that causes serious social problems, there's obviously cruelty and viciousness or indifference involved in it. I find that for many people, the reason why we are at that juncture is because these aren't parts of the mind that are normal within our own everyday thought life, but they might exist in nightmare.
Absolutely. One point sort of leading into that, I think one of the reasons that we're also so curious about all of this is because there's a part of us that has it within us. And I think sometimes we study them to help us on some level. And it's, I've heard this years ago, and I honestly don't know the source of where this came from, but it was the idea that darkness is invisible light. And I thought that's interesting to consider, just an interesting idea. So when we're afraid of the dark, there's usually something in that for us. Not saying everybody has to become an expert, but I do think that there are people who are willing to turn towards those dark things and to sort of break them down. And it helps us assimilate things and to resolve conflict and things of that nature. And if we only focus on compassion and we only focus on the light, or we only focus on these positive things, we're denying ourselves of part of what and who we are, which leads to a very unhealthy one-sidedness. Then we are suppressing. Then we're back into that territory of we're suppressing our part of ourselves. We can have an extremely healthy relationship with our shadow side, which is work we're doing when, like, for example, you get into an argument or you're in traffic and somebody cuts you off and you catch yourself reacting in a way that feels excessive for the situation, but you rein it back in, or you get curious. I wonder why that set me off. When we have that introspective layer, we're staying in a really good, healthy territory within ourselves. If we're going, oh, not me, I don't have any of that in me, it's you, that's shadow right there. Like, it's a complete denial, right? So it's sometimes I feel like we study these things to help us have greater access to the parts within ourselves that may not be activated. And I'm not saying everybody's a murderer, or everybody's a cannibal, or anything like that. But I do think there's these deeper impulses that scare us within ourselves. And if we can learn from somebody else's literalization of that, we can sort of balance out some of the stuff that's going on in the world. Because I think each of us in a different way, whether it's looking at government or other things happening, we can see what happens when we're in denial of shadow, when we're in denial of terrible things. Turning away does not make it stop. So and nightmares are actually a perfect segment for that, because nightmares mean a lot of things to different people. And so I just want to start with that and say my sharing on that subject matter isn't the end all be all, of course, and may or may not resonate for everyone, because their dreams are not fixed. They're not something that is, this is where I have a little bit of a soapbox when it comes to dream dictionaries and journals and stuff and meaning. And really, your psyche is revealing these things to you in your dream state for you, and in your own language that you can learn how to sort of unpack, decode. And if we go to a book for that, we may not get what it is that's actually being represented within our own psyche. So while we're dreaming and we're having a nightmare, my favorite example to give is being chased. That's quite a common one that many of us have. And I have so many stories, especially women, but men too. Mainly women will have this dream of being chased. And usually it's some type of either a murderous figure, a shadow figure. Sometimes it's clear. Sometimes they can't even see what's chasing them, but there's this panicky sensation to run. And there are a couple things that I've experienced. I am still actually a certified hypnotherapist, even though I don't work necessarily with people in that way anymore. But a lot of that fed a lot of my research that I didn't know I was gathering at the time. And so dreams came up as a natural part of the subject. And I just had this crazy idea one day of, like, I wonder what would happen if you just stopped running. And at first it was a little bit like, oh, I don't know if I should say that. Like, what if this is a trauma? What if this is a healthy way for this person to be processing something in their dream, right? What if it's something of that nature? And I had one particular client that I had worked with who decided to do just that. And it took some time. It was a repetitive sort of thing. It wasn't the same dream, same nightmare every time. It wasn't like she was in the same place with the same figure. But the idea was the same. Being chased was the same exact theme. And so she worked on trying to face whatever this was in her nightmare. And it took some time. It recurred a little bit. She had a few dreams where she wasn't quite able to, or she would be woken up, or she didn't know if it was her waking herself up because she was scared, or the process itself could have been a little bit too jolting to actually remember to try to do this and have consciousness while you're sleeping. Eventually, she did. I think it took about 3 or 4 of these dreams before it got to a place where she then was able to confront this figure. And when she did, it started to kind of dissolve. And then it almost like collapsed at her feet. And it turned into a fox, like a fox, which happens a lot in dreams. Or in nightmares too. There's creatures, there's animals, there's different things, and So what happened for her is when we began to break down this dream, she had what we would call a very somatic response, which is body based. So there was a lot of, she would wake up in fear and panic, things like that. When she had this image of the fox kind of settle at her feet, it took some time over months to keep digging into the meaning and uncovering new meaning. Because I'm someone that is going to ask the person to really find their own way. You can Google it, but you're kind of cheating yourself. Like, really dig in. What do you think this means? We have practices, something called active imagination, which is a Jungian technique where you take a figure from a dream, and we'd call it like your central image that you're working with. And you imagine just dialoguing with this figure, this creature. And she did that. She was able to do that with this figure. And what came about was pretty interesting. She, at the same time that this particular nightmare started for this client, she was also involved in the beginning of possibly entering into this business arrangement with an individual. And she had a feeling. She had a feeling that there was something off about it and wasn't sure if she should go through with it. And these dreams started. So that was kind of interesting, the timeline of that. And she would have these panicky dreams. What was happening is she was suppressing her instinct in her waking life. So she was busy during the day. She was active. She had too much on her plate. She was overwhelmed. So our dream state is one of the places that deeper self within us reaches us. If we're really loud in our world, it's hard to listen to instinct, to intuition, to subtlety, to feelings. And so this came out in her nightmares. So what happened ultimately was she did not move forward with the business arrangement, which actually turned out later on to be a blessing in disguise, saved her from a huge nightmare. Which that's when later on came the meaning of the fox. For her, it was this idea of something cunning, her own cunningness, her own sort of like instinctual nature was now kind of her friend, right? It was at her feet. It was sort of her way of saying, this is something I have with me. It's a supportive thing if I choose to see it that way. So that's an example of what can happen for someone, obviously in different forms and images and what have you, whether there's animals or creatures or other supportive type of imaginal things that enter into the dream state, or sometimes the creature just dissolves altogether. But it can teach us different things. Somebody being chased, another example of that same kind of thing in a vastly different dream, was someone else who had this idea and wanted to work on this book project, and they weren't doing it. And so it was actually the part of them that really wanted this was chasing them, and they're running away from it. So it was a creative force in a way, if you want to call it a force or an image or storyline, narrative, that was playing out in the psyche of her deeper impulse saying, hey, this is something you really want. Give it attention. But in her waking life, she wasn't. She was too busy. She had excuses. She didn't think it would work. She didn't see herself as a writer, but she had this really deeply passionate, desire to be a writer. And so it haunted her. So sometimes I feel like we're haunted by things that we're not doing, by what we're not saying, by what we're not confronting. And this is a way that we can kind of trace our impulses and these different figures in a healthy way, with support, of course, to see what's really going on there. Because it may not be as simple as being chased by something where I just need to wake up and forget I had the dream. It's not going to leave us until we learn to be with it in a different way. So, yeah.
I need to address these because that's usually what our mind is saying. That's what I believe with dreams. I think dreams are our subconscious mind either giving us an opportunity to confront a thought or handle a situation we may not really want to deal with. I think it leads full circle, honestly, with the talk about true self and the true shadow self, and looking around. I'll call it the basement of the human mind. I mean, it's kind of where we keep all the things where we might have tried something and it didn't work, so we stuff it in the basement. It's usually where we hide last year's Christmas ornaments that we don't want to put out next year, and these are all just figures of speech, of course, for confronting the reality of ourselves. And I find it interesting to talk about the mind and the individual and their mind, because it's this, to grab onto the image of the fox, specifically, to grab onto the image of a wild animal. I don't think there really is another animal that could probably be as wild as a fox, in its own creative, humorous aspect. And I think being able to grab a hold of that wild image, that wild animal, is what this form of psychology is helping a person embrace their true identity. And I think there's modes and methods and opportunities involved in studying our own dreams to figure this out. But how would one go about that, confronting basically their own inner manufactured demons?
So good. Such a great question. There's so many different ways. I love the active imagination process that I mentioned, which is really just sort of, I tell people pretending. I don't believe in pretend, but I use that language because I think it helps soften the ego's resistance to it. If we say, okay, I'm just making this up, I'm just pretending, then it kind of like gives us weird permission on a deeper level to explore it. So I'll say, just pretend, pretend that shadowy figure is sitting in front of you, or the fox, or someone. It doesn't even have to be a nightmare, but it can be a sort of ominous thing that was in a dream that we just don't know what to do with it. And you can imagine having it before you, and you might close your eyes or you might keep your eyes open. And I will always recommend journaling, like just start writing, because that part of writing has a way of drawing out the things from within the unconscious. And if we stay with our words, if we stay with the impulse of moving the pen on paper versus, I don't like using computers for this kind of a thing, because there's something about holding the pen in your hand and letting it move and really engaging and not censoring. Don't worry about how does this sound? Is this making sense? I don't care if you're scribbling, drawing, just dialogue. And you will discover something. At first, you might discover, wow, I have a lot of resistance. Maybe a part of me doesn't want to know. Maybe, and we can become curious instead of fixed, right? We can start to get curious about, I wonder if maybe I'm afraid. Maybe I feel silly. Maybe I feel something else. Usually a dream can point us to an energy that was unresolved from a different time and space. So what I usually will tell people at that point is to say, okay, if you are feeling really silly about this engagement with this figure, this dream, and you're feeling kind of blocked and you're just not getting to the point of what this could be, the next question I might say is there shame or guilt around imagination, around play? And if so, how old do you feel when you're practicing this exercise? Because usually somebody will say, like, man, I don't know why. It's like I kind of feel like a 6 or 7 year old. I feel a little ridiculous, intimidated, overwhelmed, vulnerable. It's usually a different part of themselves that's kind of hijacking the situation, right? And so we can come at it from that perspective of active imagination and dialoguing with that figure. My favorite, though, I will say, my favorite ultimate way to work with different things is to look at fairy tales and to work with the psychology in fairy tales. And usually what a client will do is a little bit of research on their own. And I make sure, I'm like, you need to go to the Grimm's tales, no watered down version. I'm not going to say who or what, but no, watered down version of fairy tales. We want the old school ones because they are built in with life challenges. They don't always have happy endings. They are very grim. There is dismemberment. There are these really weird villainous creatures and experiences because they're showing all different parts of the psyche, and it gives us something to project on so we can see ourselves in the narrative of the storyline, the protagonist or the hero or whatever it might be. We can see ourselves as the villain. We can see ourselves as the vulnerable one. But there's also, and you mentioned basements, there's also this idea that the places we go in a fairy tale can show us where we are in our consciousness. And often when we're going somewhere, we're going deeper into the unconscious. the basement, the descent down and in. We have the dark woods, that's the unconscious, the ocean depths into a cave. All of these things mimic going into these deeper parts of ourselves. And then what's beautiful about fairy tales is they don't eliminate conflict. They make us go through a little bit of struggle. We learn something about ourselves. We discover power, resiliency, something else. And so the transformative power in fairy tales to help us discover a hidden pattern or narrative is mind-blowing. I've witnessed people cure, and I don't want to say cure, let's say shift different experiences that others, other modalities or perspectives hadn't yet been able to help them with. Most recently, I observed a client who was able to change her relationship with alcohol because she started to recognize herself in a certain fairy tale. And she realized that there was a similar feeling that and this took a lot of work for her to get here. But what would happen is when she would drink, she would get toward the bottom of that bottle, and and her being drunk reminded her of the disempowered state she had when she was being told horrible things from people that were supposed to take care of and love her. So there's a lot of trauma in her past. And so we looked at, this idea of being poisoned and being poisoned by the ones you love, and how her mimicking with the alcohol was her way of poisoning herself so that there was still a relationship intact between these terrible people and how they treated her, because she had this deep need to stay connected to her family of origin. So once she realized this really interesting, bizarre connection between the poison they told her and the poison she was choosing, she had a choice. And she made the choice for herself to put it down. And it was almost as if just reading these different fairy tales lifted the veil, and she was able to see so clearly what the ego had been suppressing. And if we remember that the ego is doing this out of this preservation sort of state, it wants us to be safe. It doesn't want more pain. We're going to be sometimes also, though, avoiding the things that can help us heal, move forward. So fairy tales are a great way to help us access things without necessarily re-traumatizing an individual or forcing them to relive or face things in other ways. They can confront parts of themselves within the tale, or confront parts of others, especially narcissistic qualities, psychopathic qualities, in this way where there's this psychological distance that helps them feel safe. And it's the same reason I feel like some of us watch psychological thrillers and horror movies, because we get to symbolically work things out within the unconscious that we may not even know needs to be processed.
That's right. All right. I do want to ask the demons question. I mean, what if demons were real? Then what?
Oh my gosh. Everybody wants to ask me this question all of a sudden. It's so funny. And I like to say, and just be completely transparent and say, I don't know. I really don't know the answer, because I am absolutely someone that believes that I really think almost anything's possible. And the way that I have experienced things like that has been through the perspective of a client. So I haven't necessarily, through my own life, witnessed something that I would call a demon or demonic. I've seen and heard and experienced some absolutely horrific things. And I could see where someone would want to demonize that quality, that trait, that action, for sure. Especially the research, the things I've read on serial killers and the rituals and habits and behaviors. And I do find that working with people that hold the belief that it's real, it serves them to have someone that believes it with them on their behalf, not keeping them. And I'm not saying it's an illusion or that it's not real. I see this along the lines of working with past lives, extraterrestrials. I can't see whether that's real or not through my own lens. And I'm certainly not dismissive of those that have stories or experiences or evidence. I think it's fascinating. I think anything's possible. And I've seen a lot of healing and growth come from being believed and investigating that. I also have this little bit of a thing in my mind, and I don't know if this is helpful or a block, but I'll just be transparent when I say a lot of things that I think are demons or are evil. I can see where they can sometimes be a projection of someone's absolutely worst fear that they don't know what to do with. And I've also experienced it because I'm someone that from a very young age, my intuition has been through the roof. Through my own traumas and experiences, my intuition has been exceptional in some situations that I haven't been able to make sense of. I can't tell you how I knew what I knew, but I knew it, and there were facts and there were evidence. And so it was a huge part of my career was using that instinct to help others. And that was demonized from the outside. I had people telling me I was doing devil's work or that it was not of this religion or that religion. While I'm watching people have transformational experiences in their life of just acceptance and love and forgiveness and all this amazing stuff because I was able to tune into something that someone else would see as evil. So for that reason, I try to keep it, I try to say that I don't know what I don't know. But in my not knowing, I'm not closed off to it. I think that we're not meant to know everything about everything. I think there's a lot of, whether it's malevolence, whether it's evil, whether it's demons, whether it's the other divine numinous experiences, either end of those types of things are really difficult for us to fathom on some level and overwhelm the nervous system. And for some of us, we go into fight or flight. Some of us, we freeze. Some of us, we want, I think it's our human nature to want to make sense and meaning of something. The mind doesn't like ambiguity. It doesn't like not having an answer. It wants to know. And for that reason, I kind of challenge that line a little bit to say, maybe, maybe. I definitely believe in archetypes. I believe that they have a force and energy that comes with them that can be absolutely destructive if we're not listening, paying attention. I think we see it play out. I think we've normalized it to some degree in some capacity. But I think on some level, those energies for sure are real. To what degree? I don't know.
That's fine. I understand. I mean, there's a couple of really awesome books. And this is going to show how boring I can be. I think it was Clarissa Estes.
Yeah, Clarissa Pinkola Estes. Yeah.
Women Who Run with Wolves. That's a real good one for ladies to look at. And then there's one by Moore and Gillette for men, and that's the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, rediscovering the archetypes of mature masculine, I think is there's my brain trying to work at the books that I've read on these specific archetype stuff. But I wanted to end the show by talking about your Substack. You've got a new Substack that you're launching, and let's talk about some of the aims, goals, desires, dreams for the Substack and where people can find it, etc.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, first of all, for the opportunity. I love these conversations. They're so much fun. And I think it's important that we have spaces where we can talk about challenging things, dark things. And so I did start a Substack. It's basically, for those of you that are new to that terminology, it's kind of like a connected blog, a space for writers and content creators, actually, who can come together and you can share your audios, your written word, videos, things like that. And so I created a Substack. Mine is called Hauntingly Beautiful Things, because I absolutely love the idea of pushing the boundaries of what we think darkness is. And it doesn't always have to be ugly. It doesn't always have to be dangerous and terrible. My personality has always been on the darker side of things, my interest. And so one of the ways I made peace with that was finding beauty in it and finding beauty and meaning in terrible experiences. And so I have this writing platform. It's being put together right now. It is out there. You can find it. There's very little content on there. It's all sort of being curated so that on my birthday, which is August 12th, so if you're listening to this before then, it's not out yet, but after, you can find it. But August 12th on my birthday is when it officially launches, and I'll have a bunch of content. I'll talk about nightmares. Hauntingly Beautiful Things is also, just these strange phenomenon, these interesting things like like, cemeteries and moss on a headstone, or the sound of a train horn, like a train as it's like echoing through a forest. And these qualities that have a hauntedness to them, but there's beauty in it. And so that's sort of framework for how I write, how I pull things together. I haven't figured this out yet, but I am working on a scale so that it's like a darkness scale so that you know what to expect. I don't believe in trigger warnings, but I do believe in some type of a scale that helps the reader to say, I'm not going to keep going because she's going to be probably talking about serial killers or something past this point. So there will be sort of a scale for those that want more of the Jungian, imaginal, fairy tale side of things, a little lighter shade, we'd say gray instead of black. That is going to be available. And then subscribers can also pay for additional content. And I have it at a reasonable price right now. It'll be set for $5 a month. I want this material to be accessible to people. And I think it's important to have spaces to have these conversations. And the other thing that's launching with that at the same time is my podcast, which will be called A Dose of Depth with Melissa Kim Corter. And same kind of conversations happening. And it'll be interviews, it'll be personal conversations, examples. I do a lot of analysis on film, forensics, and fairy tales. And so that's going to be a whole place for all of that type of conversation to be going on there.
And website for people to find you at?
Sure. So you can go to my website, melissacorter.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, BT. This is great. And thank you for what you're doing. These conversations are so important. And it was really nice chatting with you today, and a lot of great subjects that we got to cover.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.